Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is segregate. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways that we use this verb. The first way you'll hear segregate used is to mean to set apart or isolate from the rest. So you can imagine with this having some particular group and then removing one, two, or some small group from that larger group. A second way the verb segregate is used is to mean to separate or divide along racial, sexual, or religious lines. Now, I chose this verb for today's video because it's a verb that's been coming up in some of my English classes with students. We're reading stories about prominent Black Americans in honor of Black History Month. And as part of their story, we need to understand how people had been or were separated along racial lines here in the United States for very long periods of time. And some would argue still, in some contexts, it's still happening in 2022. A third way you'll hear the verb segregate used is to mean to separate a pair of alleles at meiosis. Okay? Now, you might be looking at that third definition and thinking, wow, there are some other words I don't know there. But this particular usage is directed to the area of biology. If you kind of look at how cells divide and grow, you might hear segregate used. Outside of studying kind of a higher level biology, you might not hear this verb. So I'm not going to talk a lot more about this, but I do want some people to be aware that they might hear this if they're taking upper level courses in the field of biology. You should know that segregate is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of the verb, you should drop the E and then add ing to form segregating. The past tense and participle forms of this verb are going to have an ed ending, but our base verb already ends in an E, so we're not having two E's at the end. Our base verb, segregate, ends in a T sound. So our past tense ending is going to make an id sound. We're adding an extra syllable as we say this verb. It should sound like this: segregated, segregated. Okay. Now, let's take a moment to look at some phrasal verbs with segregate. You'll notice here the meanings aren't very different from those that we looked at earlier, but I wanted you to be aware that you might see segregate from. So with this, we're separating from a larger group. So again, ties back to that first definition. An example of this might be, for this activity, we'll segregate the boys from the girls. Another phrasal verb we should look at is segregate into. So again, we're separating into one or more groups or sections that are being sort of isolated from a larger group. An example of this might be, I'll segregate the food into different allergy groups. I know this is happening with some families, particularly if they have large gatherings. There can be people who have an allergy to dairy or to nuts or other items, and so we might group or separate what food is safe for those with a dairy allergy on this table, and then food that's safe for those with a nut allergy on this table. That's the idea that's being conveyed here. Now, for additional verb tense practice today, I want us to take a look at the passive voice and the active voice in the simple past tense. And I have a very specific reason for doing this. I told you that I've been reading some stories with my students about prominent Black Americans. And I was looking through various forms and various stories, trying to find something that was interesting and that would continue to build my students' vocabulary lesson skills and just build their vocabulary. And I kept noticing that this verb segregate was being used in the passive voice. And I think it's important for us to kind of note that, look at it, and also think about what that means. So, in other videos, I've done kind of a deeper dive into the difference between passive and active voice. But essentially, what you should know is that with the passive voice, the person or people, the subject who's responsible for the action, is not beginning the sentence. So what you see at the beginning of the sentence is the object, right? Who received the action, or what things received a particular action. And I'm quite confident, I've heard and I've read about this in other places, and I can't remember who I should be giving credit to, but I want you to know this is not my original idea. But it's important to know many books will start with this passive voice. So I'm going to look at it in the affirmative. Black patients were segregated into their own wards and they received substandard care. Now, a sentence similar to this was used to describe what happened in Washington, D.C. hospitals in the 1800s. Okay, so again, that idea of separating by race. So it's going back to our second definition. But if you look, so our passive voice is made here by using a past form of the be verb. So we're talking about more than one patient who received this action. It was many, so we're using were, and then we use the participle form of the verb here. But when we look at this, we don't know who's responsible for the action, right? And it's people who look like me. So I think it's, again, kind of interesting for us to look at and pay attention to. I think maybe a better sentence or a better way to talk about what has happened in our history might be to use the active voice here. The hospital segregated Black patients into their own wards and they received substandard care. So here, like, we should sort of note who was making the decisions, who decided to separate along races. Okay. Now, in terms of making active voice, right? You can just see there, it's just the ed form of the verb. That is going to be true no matter what our subject is. Okay, so we do have to kind of look at the beginning of our passive voice sentences to pay attention if we're going to use was or were before we use the participle. That is not a concern in the active voice. Okay. Let's take a look at negative passive voice in the simple past tense. Sorry. I have an example sentence here. The bus station restaurant was not segregated. Okay, so you can see the structure there. Was, then not, and then the participle form of the verb. Okay. This was a story talking about how many restaurants were segregated in a certain part of Arizona, and the article mentioned there was one that was not segregated, right? But again, we should kind of pay attention who made this decision. Was a very old story, so I'm not exactly sure the owner, the operator, but the operator did not segregate the bus station restaurant, right? So here we can see did not, and then our base verb. That's how we make the negative in the active voice. Okay. Now let's take a look at making questions. If you're just starting to read or learn about kind of racial issues here in the United States, you might have some questions. You might ask, were public libraries segregated? Right? So this idea, and the crazy answer to that is yes. It's one of those things kind of hard to wrap your mind around, that someone's race would impact whether they could go into a particular library. Now, again, we can make that active voice and ask the question, did community leaders segregate public libraries? So here I'm using did, then I've got my subject, who was responsible for that action, then the base verb. Okay, so I'm only using that ed form in the affirmative in active voice in the simple past. Our structure stays a little more consistent in the passive voice. So we're using a past form of be and then the participle form of the verb in our affirmative, negative, and our yes or no question. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb segregate. The first word we're going to look at is the noun form of this word, segregation. And I'll point out, because this has been challenging for some of my students, the TI here is going to make an SH sound as we say it. Segregation, shun. Okay. Now, this can have a couple meanings like our verb. The first would be the action or state of setting someone or something apart from other people or other things. Okay, so an example of this: age segregation can have a negative impact on quality of life. So I borrowed this sentence from a report that sort of looked at that in terms of senior citizens, so older individuals, and how their quality of life was different if they were living in a community with people of greater divergence or differences in age than if they were living solely in communities with just people of about the same age. Now, the more common way for you to hear the noun segregation used is to, again, refer to the period in time in the United States where there was enforced separation of different racial groups. And so an example of this would be in the US, racial segregation was mandated by law in some states until the US Supreme Court struck down these laws. Okay, so again, setting that this I think illustrates really well that idea of enforced separation, right? Not just like we would like it if, but there are going to be consequences if you break these rules. Now, another related word you might hear is the noun segregationist. This is a person who supports the policy of separating racial groups. So an example of this might be, are there still schools named for famous segregationists? And again, the unfortunate answer is yes to that. So there have been people throughout history who have been very vocal supporters that yes, we should have policies and races should be separated. And some of those people are still honored by having their names on public school buildings. Now, the word segregationist can also be used as an adjective. This means relating to or advocating for the policy of enforced separation of different racial groups. An example of this could be, his segregationist ideas will move the country backwards. Right? So perhaps this sentence is being said about a candidate running for office. So segregationist is describing ideas, the noun there. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.